the bottom line for me is belonging, and asking a question of where do you belong and how deep the wells of a question like that are. The sense of belonging, you could say, sits on a parallel journey to the question of lostness. There's like an admission of lostness first. I think becoming lost is one of the best things we could possibly do in modernity. There's a part of me which believes that no person raised without elders could ever fully become elder themselves. But what's the job then of pretending well enough and being able to say, look, we're modeling this, we're doing the best we can, and it's a multi-generational response to this multi-generational wounding. But the position of anyone being full and complete, and I know where I am, and I'm not lost, and I'm this thing, and I'm becoming more and more skeptical of that position. So yeah, I think it's really lovely how that we're doing double speak around the word lost. And it feels like a really interesting place to be in, of what is lost, what is unlost.
Sam Crosby, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you on this magical spring morning?
I am good. This is a conversation I'm excited to have, and I am between Newquay and Perranporth in Cornwall.
Yes.
Close enough to the sea if I've got the energy to get there by foot, or I can roll down on a bike.
Yay, I'm not remotely envious. Actually, I am. We were looking at a map of where you were just before we came on air, and yeah, being able to smell the sea, there's something so special about it. And every human I've ever met finds the sea magical and alluring. And the theory that we emerged from the oceans rather than climbing down from the trees does seem quite compelling with that, I feel.
Yes, yeah. It's a good way. Heart, nose, ears. They're all engaged, aren't they, with the business of the sea? Yeah.
Yes, and awe and wonder, and everything that goes with it.
Mm.
Anyways, we are recording this just before the equinox and the new moon and all of the astonishing things that are happening in the world at the moment, which will undoubtedly be different before this goes out in about 10 days' time. But you are a mythocartographer, amongst many, many other things. And in a very beautiful Substack post that you sent me, you say, amongst a lot of things that I hope we'll unpick, as maps, myths are multidimensional, and myths are beyond maps. And given that I feel the way through for humanity, through the pinch point that we are creating, is to be able to map out routes forward to a future that we would be proud to leave behind, which everybody can now recite in their sleep who listens to this podcast, coming across someone else who sees mythology and maps as intertwined and necessary and useful to where we're going is such a joy. So, maps and myths. Talk to me in any way about what maps and myths mean to you and how they came to mean. That was a very wide boundary question. Take it wherever you want it to go.
I appreciate the potential here. The moment of uncertainty also being the moment of potential. I'm just noticing what's coming up for me, and it's not in the essay or in the conversation we've already had, but the potential of a map, the possibility of a map. One of the images I've got for what joy means for me is walking out into a big sky space with just a few things in my wits and my heart and my eyes, and I think a map and a myth, both precursors to that. So there's a feeling there, and I think what I'd like to do in the time that we have is play with naming, the kenning, play with the idea of there not being a single name for anything, and so let's call this a bunch of imperfect attempts at naming this thing. The opening of the essay is the mountain leader trainers said to me, when you get really lost, don't look at your map. Because what you'll do is you'll find features on a map and you'll convince yourself that they match the territory that you're in. So what ends up happening is you are now lost, but you're convinced that you're not lost. And taking that on a broader scale, the question is, what are the maps that we're in that we are protecting so that we can feel that desire for certainty that we hanker for. What maps are we using? Are we in that we are protecting, even if they're detrimental to us? What's the process of seeing them and behaving with them differently? And mythology being a map and beyond a map, in the shorthand for me, is when a myth comes into a space. It's the reason that there's never been a good film about King Arthur. When a myth comes into a space, every single person in that space has a different anchor point, a different image, a different way in, so that it's as many people and beings are in the space. That's how many versions of the story there are simultaneously unfolding. And so they simultaneously give us some information that one part of us knows that we desperately want, and give us a signifier that, oh, maybe there isn't a one map at the same time.
And you're clearly on a roll, and I want you to come back to that role, but I am suddenly intrigued about there never being a good film about King Arthur, partly because I don't watch films, so I don't know.
Yeah.
But Arthur, Pendragon, in almost all of the concepts, unless you were born in Edinburgh, and clearly you have Arthur's seat and Arthur came from Edinburgh, let's leave that aside. Arthur and Cornwall are very closely linked, and I'm a writer and books are my thing, and for me there are two books, or one is a series, that really gave me access to the mythological Arthur. And I can tell you what they are later, but I'm really curious to know if there are any, for you, any books that give people access to Arthur. That's one. And the other is that for me, the film of Lord of the Rings, which I did watch, was actually a remarkable route in to books that were, frankly, needed a bit of editing. I'm sorry for people for whom they are basically canon law, but they could have been, there could have been a degree of tightening of those, and it would not necessarily have hurt the structure. And so it's not the case necessarily that films can't give access. It's just that they haven't. Partly, I guess, because Arthur feels so much more weighted for the producers that they're perhaps afraid to go there. But anyway, so have there been any books for you that really brought the whole concept of the Arthurian mythology alive?
So there are so many things happening simultaneously for me at the moment, and two of these are big headlines in the work. I'll mention one and then park it, which is, as somebody who spends their time, their joy resourcing allies, so much of the different aspects of my life point in towards this work with mythology. Somebody who spends time with myth in this way, I found it so difficult to come back to the myths of my place. It was a round trip. I've been to Siberia and Australia and North America, and I don't mean physically.
No, but in the mythology of those places.
Yeah,
right. And then Arthur is Cornwall.
Yes, and coming home to some of the mythic landscape that I'm physically inhabiting, I found it. I mean, I can feel my eyes prickling as I think about it. Properly difficult. So, park that. The other is there is one book, but I'm not going to name it because I don't think it's that important. I think what is important is the way I approached this book. So, one of the biggest challenges that I found around King Arthur is that the modern again, this kind of desire for certainty, the sense-making business we're all up to. Arthur's story very quickly turns into a where, who, when, etc. Edinburgh. There are Italians who have told me that's where Excalibur's come from. There are Americans who have told me certain bridges were involved in Arthur, and that's just in the culture. And there are so many. I mean, the shelf I have above my desk is largely given to Arthur, and there are so many books that I let into my space and let go again, which were myth, man or legend. Where was it? The kind of the walks you can do, the sites, the Slaughter Bridge around the corner, and Tintagel, and all the sites that are down here. And what I found by being given access to myth in a different way that we'll inevitably make our way towards in this conversation was, I don't want to spend my time with the sense aspects of this. I'm more interested in the meaning aspects. So moving myself and my center of gravity around allowed me to approach even Christian de Troyes and Morte d'Arthur and all the classics, being able to go towards them and say, you know what, I'm going to just do what I do with story, which is see how it touches something, has some verve, has some movement in my body, has some aspect of the way I'm raising my children or the way I move around my village that are responding, and let that in, not diligently memorizing the names and the places and the information in it. And I did that, and it took me a year and a half. And the first time I told King Arthur, it took me 6 hours, and that's just his story without going anywhere near Parzival and Tristan and Isolde and Gawain. And yeah, let's. And I was really ill afterwards. The most ill I've maybe been in my life for about a week and a half afterwards. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, it was.
But what
Something
happened
moved.
in the wake of that? When you recovered, where were you that you hadn't been before? Because there will have been a place.
I was beyond the academic line, beyond the academic veil, beyond the I'm a rationalist. I was raised a rationalist, and my life's work is that I'm enamored by the idea of animism.
Right.
And I play with that as much as I can, and I'm cracking the carapace. And this was just such a stride forward in the way of seeing the multitudes of everything within a story that's so bound up in chivalry and rescuing maidens and all the nonsense that doesn't represent anything like the deep fecund femininity that comes up with some of the other more rash myths around the world. So yeah, I'm following Clarissa Pinkola Estes into down into what she calls get down dirty ways of myth. It allowed me into that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Right. She, for people listening who don't recognize names, she wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves. And I will find a link and put it in the show notes. God, already we've moved off the narrative that I thought we were going, the arc, but into very, very fertile land. I think this is so interesting. There are so many different ways we can take this. What is top of my head actually is that I had a conversation with somebody quite a long time ago. There was a point after I wrote the Boudica books, where I wrote the Rome books, and the Rome books arose because my publishers said no more woo-woo stuff, and I let them say that because I was too young and naive in the publishing world not to go, no, sod off, it's what I do. And so I wrote a series of Roman era spy thrillers because I am particularly entertained by cryptography, and I think it's fascinating, and the whole way people can present as something that they're not. And I had discovered that the Great Fire of Rome was lit, probably, by people who believed that their Messiah would only come back after Rome had burned under the eye of the dog star, Sirius, and the fire was lit the night that Sirius rose over Rome in that particular year. And it happened just after the end of the Boudican Revolt. And I thought, I was still at the point where if I don't write another good book, I'm going to have to go back to the day job, and there was nothing I wanted less than to be a vet again, sorry. And so those books arose. But as a result of that, I believed and still believe that I uncovered the historical basis for Christ, which my publishers then proceeded to bury under a large pile of bricks so that nobody really noticed it because they were afraid they'd be firebombed. And that was 20 years ago, so the risk of being firebombed is probably greater now. But we were still in a place where the conversation that I had was along the lines of somebody in some talk I was giving said, well, there was no evidence that this woman called Boudica existed. And without really thinking, I said, well, we have more evidence of that than we do of the existence of Christ, and nobody actually queries that one. And that rolled forward to there's actually more evidence about the existence of someone called King Arthur than there is for someone called Christ, for which there's no evidence at all other than hearsay. And I'm really interested about the mythologies that we choose to build, that you've come across around Arthur, and that our entire world has imposed on it, because 2,000 years of Christianity, and now we've got the Christian nationalists who think that they're going to create the end times by causing war in the Middle East. And it's a mythology that feeds into, it feels to me. You said with Arthur, there's all of the chivalry and the heroic stuff and the knights in armor, and total anachronism that nevertheless becomes part of our current oral history of who we are and where we arose and what it is to be human. And there is a layer underneath it that is quite different and that would be more generative in our times. And that's where your Substack was taking us, was towards the, how do we uncover different maps? How do we evolve different maps? What would those different maps feel like? And how do we raise them up to a point where they are strong enough, like little pioneer saplings, to grow on the hillside of who we are in the place of the pretty toxic maps that are there, which I think is where you were going before I interrupted about Arthur anyway. But it feels like that's so rich, and it's so, we don't, as a whole, you were raised a rationalist, I was raised a rationalist. Mythology isn't there as part of, we're told the world is scientific, 2 + 2, atoms and electrons and molecules and chemistry. And people like Rupert Sheldrake go, okay, guys, shall we look at the mythology underpinning all of this, that the things that you guys are taking before you build anything else? And then he isn't allowed back, and his TED Talk is the one that's been removed from the whole of the internet, except it hasn't. And the myths are still so integral to our culture. How do we evolve new myths? How did you evolve a new myth?
So we're going to need 6 hours.
That's fine.
Clear
Guys, it's going to be a
calendar.
long podcast. We'll break it into bits. No worries.
If it's okay for me to do a few stepping stones, I think stepping stones is a good analogy. I found myself writing into, I think, Drop the Map, which is the podcast, into the introduction, that we were going to be taking stepping stones across the ocean. So I think let me be careful with that word. My experience of the world changed significantly when my son was. So he was born with a profound brain disorder, and the systems and structures and people around me didn't know how to meet that experience. I was offered cups of tea. I was offered scientific explanations for things. We were told phrases like failure to thrive, and given a list of things that might end his life. He's still with us. He's 6. He's got piles of blonde hair and sharp blue eyes. And one of my favorite phrases I've ever alighted on for describing his personality is that his smile is as easy to coax out as a puppy's wagging tail. And he is the light of our lives, and was a source of fracture for me. I went for a run one day and disturbed a flock of jackdaws, lifted off into the air, and left behind a pigeon with a broken wing. And I found my knees going down into the ground. I expressed myself in a way I've never done as an adult before. And I bellowed and keened and cried, and I was muddy, and I ran down to the sea and got in the sea and ran back up the hill. And if I'd have had Strava going on that day, I'd have set a record I would never have been able to beat in the rest of my life. There was something moving in me, spirit or adrenaline or something in between, that just kept me moving. And in the wake of that moment, allowing myself to see a brokenness in the world, the broken wing of the pigeon, and the black cloud of wings above, and something broke that could have bent and snapped back into place again. I could have looked at that time and said, well, well, that nearly got bad, didn't it? Well, back to day then. Off we go. And instead, I didn't. I went to pieces, all to pieces. I went down to the underworld, um, and then I found a video of a guy called Danny Deardorff. You might North American storyteller, um, and he's since died. He was telling a story about a man coming to a crossroads, a horse and a wolf, and it's a story that I tell often now. It's the image. In fact, let me give it to you. A guy comes to a crossroads, and it's the first time he's ever left home, and he's the scruffy third sibling, and his oldest brother, the big fella, and the middle brother, the poetic fella with flowers falling out of his sleeves. They're both in the pub round the corner. They set out on the same task, got to the crossroads, and went to the pub instead. He gets to the crossroads, and there's a standing stone which says, "Keep going the way you're already going. You will die, and so will your horse. If you go to the right, your horse will live on, but you will die. If you go to the left, you will live, but your horse will." So it's either keep going without making a choice, everything goes, go to the right, you die for your horse, left, you live and your horse dies. And by the way, there are bones everywhere around this crossroads from people who just didn't make the choice, just stayed there. And who knows how many other people went by without even noticing the crossroads. Anyway, he notices, he goes down onto his knees, he keens, he screams, he cries, he stands, he leads his horse to the left, the direction in which he will live, but his horse will. And he's going some way down that path, patting the horse, rubbing its neck, feeding it things. And a huge wolf comes flying out of the trees and eats the horse and disappears back into the trees again. And it's bloody and shocking. And he's down on his knees again and he's crying. And then the wolf comes back. And this guy is looking up at the wolf, even though the guy is standing. It's the size of this. And then the wolf looks down at the man and opens his mouth, and there's blood. Eyes ablaze. And the wolf says, "Why are you crying?" And the young man, tries to explain the significance of everything he's lost. The saddlebags were full of instructions and maps and gold, tools and weapons and information from his family and so on. And all that comes out is a guttural sound. And the wolf speaks, "Climb on my back and I'll take you where you need to go." And he does. And he spends the rest of the story flying over the forests and over the mountains and the rivers, and it goes on and on and on. And he comes back to that crossroads, and I won't tell you what happens there,
But you have to, Sam. You can't leave everybody.
it's a much longer story that I can give you time for. Just to say, that's what happened for me. That's how I allowed myself to move beyond somebody who I was a rationalist facing something deeply irrational. I'd already rejected wholesale mainstream religion. Everything else was woo-woo. I used to live in Totnes. I went to Dartington College of Arts when it was doing, when there was a theatre degree there. And I remember walking up the high street of Totnes where people would be offering gong showers, and it was the epitome of absurdity to me at the time. And it just happens to be, by the way, that Martin Shaw, who I spent some time with, and Danny Deardorff, who I mentioned earlier, were both in Dartington delivering stories whilst I was there and didn't know about it, and probably would have seen a poster and laughed at it. I walked by. So we are facing reckonings. I think rationalists facing irrationality, retirees facing purposelessness, activists facing imposter syndrome, professionals facing hollowness around materialism. I think we're all facing, again, let me be careful. I think there is a reckoning happening, and I think there are different manifestations of it. And meeting us are opportunities to go towards something older, something more deeply rooted. And Arthur and chivalry and some of the things that are codified into the chivalric language don't allow that sort of thing. And when I tell the story, actually, Arthur is multitudes. He's not one guy. He's wearing chainmail and he's muddy and you couldn't see his face. for how muddy he is in some images, and in others he's plumed like the peacocks, and in others he's a loving man, and he is every cathedral in that story is a stand of trees at the bottom of a mountain simultaneously. It has to, which is why there have been no good films about King Arthur. And I'll give you one more image, which the point that I haven't made that I'd like to land this in is that there's a gentleness, I think, that could be available for people to move one step along. It's not an organized religion. It's not a massive ideology to just hear a story. But when you recognize parts of yourself being reflected back to you in 1,000-year-old mythology, something of the center of gravity of me and mine moves slightly towards ours and us and an interbeingness without putting that at the first step. It's a more gentle way to walk towards a broader worldview. And the image I wanted to put here was King Arthur pulls a sword from the stone and becomes the right wise king of Britain. And later down the line, he scampers away now and again, and he disappears off. And his bodyguard Kay has to sort of chase after him. Long-suffering foster brother chases after him. You can't do this anymore. You're the king. You've got to come back. So that's a business. And he's disappeared this one day, and he's in a fight beyond his ken. And he's got to the point where the sword he's pulled from the stone has been snapped off at the hilt. And so he's swinging a hilt with no sword, with no blade. And he's about to have his life ended by this errant knight that he's having a fight with. And Merlin shows up and freezes the sea and says, you can't come out, you bloody pain in the ass. We need to go back to the court now. You can't do this sort of stuff. And the errant knight is unfrozen, and it's revealed that he was fighting the king, and he makes his apologies and dedicates himself to Camelot. Anyway, Merlin says to Arthur, we need to take you back to the court, or back to the trees, or back to the yew tree, wherever it is that the story's landing for the participants of the. And Arthur says something like, I don't know much about kings, but I do know that there's no such thing as a king without a sword. So I'm not going back, Merlin, not with this. And he holds up the hilt. So Merlin says, fine, I know a place. And they go a little way, as long as they need to go for the story to unfold. Maybe it takes 30,000 years or 25 minutes. And they come to a mirror reflecting the sky. It's an extraordinary lake. And Merlin says, have a look. And there's an arm sticking out of the water with a sword on the end of it. It's just going, there you go. And Arthur sort of double takes and then finds himself walking out on top of the water, mind you. Gets to the sword, looks down. He can see a form underneath the water. In fact, he can see lights down there's a city down there, which, by the way, is where Lancelot comes from later. And he comes back to the edge of the water. And he holds this sword in his hand, and he draws it from the scabbard, and he holds it. And Merlin says, now, what you have in your hand there is Caliburn, cut steel, Excalibur. When you swing that sword, it cuts into the other world. It's the most powerful known thing in the universe. It's extraordinary. He says, but Arthur, the scabbard is more powerful than the sword. If you wear that around your waist on that belt, you'll never die from blood loss. And Merlin says to Arthur, now, I need you to understand something. You die to blood loss. I've seen it. Your son kills you. Knowing that, which of these would you keep if you had to choose one of them? And Arthur doesn't even hear him. Holds a sword above his head and screams, what is it? What was the name again? Excalibur. Excalibur! Across the lake. Excalibur. Puts it back in the scabbard and the story continues. And I'm now in this in-between space with you, Mando. Do I let that just sit? Let's just let that sit. And whoever's listening, let that sit. What is it to let the image of the king of kings in the mythic British landscape to have been offered the choice between a sword related to cutting and a scabbard related to blood? How does he choose, and what does that mean of being a leader?
Yeah. And a sword related to death, and a scabbard related to life. There are a lot of other ways to die, mind you, and blood loss is by far not the worst. Gosh.
And if we were sat together and we had time and there were others in the room, the process after this, after some embodiment, some breathing and some time and letting the twist of the starling be involved, the next step would be a game of yes and. Everything that we say from now on about that image can hold for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm really struck by the fact that both the stories that you told had life and death choices at the crux. And that each of them is a man. And the other things involved, the horse got no agency. I'm doing a workshop with some people later in the week, and how much agency we give the living things around us is crucial to what I'm talking about. So I'm thinking about that a lot just now. Because one of the things we know of, or we believe we know, one of the mythologies that we are taught by the science of neurology, neuroscience, neuropsychopathology, whatever, is that essential to our well-being is a sense of agency. And for those of us listening, you won't have seen the fact that Sam just drank out of a mug that is almost identical to my mug, and we have never met before, and I find that really quite striking. So people on YouTube can see that we have very similar earth-shaped mugs. They're round and they're big, and they hold a whole pint of whatever you're drinking, which in my case is feverfew, and it's lovely. Agency. So it feels to me one of the very, very, very many fertile, I'll do that again, sorry guys. It feels to me one of the very, very many fertile threads that you are laying out for us is the agency of what it is to be alive. Who has the agency, and how do we choose the nature of life and the nature of death? I was talking to somebody recently who's training to be a death doula, and at the point where we were having an email interchange, something came past in my Facebook feed where someone that I only know on Facebook was asking their group, anyone who knew them, they had a close relative who'd just entered a hospice, and the hospice nurse had finished describing all the bits of technology, and here's how you get pain relief, and here's what you do. You need to press a button, and is there anything else? And the person who is now on a definite road towards whatever comes next says, what I really want is help with how to die. And the nurse said, I'm sorry, that's not in my remit, and walked out of the room. And there is a reality in which that's it's not. They're not trained. And yet, we're all going to die. And learning how to die with grace feels to me one of the most important things, and a sense of agency that comes around that we could offer. But I also think that learning how to die is coterminous with learning how to live. If we've lived every moment as if it were alive with the magic of being alive, then death becomes another part of that magic. It's harder to live a life where every moment is alive with the magic of being alive, unless we have absolutely come to terms with the fact that crossroads is one we will get to, and we will be able to choose how we cross it. And our culture veers away from both of those, and we sedate our lives and ignore the fact that we're going to die until we're in the hospice and someone says, I'm sorry, that's not in my remit. And when you take this out to people, is this a thread that is lifted up, the nature of life and the choices around death? And where does it take people?
Thank you for sharing that image. I think I'm still in the position, and I hope I always can stay something like this posture between who I am and am becoming, and who I was, and the shape of both of those worlds. And I think for anyone listening, if the image of a nurse saying it's beyond my remit to play with how to die, if that fizzed, if there was some physical response to that, that to me might be something of either you know it well and you're playing here and you're already familiar with it, but if it feels new, that to me is the calling of this stuff. That feeling of how that's the question. That's the question. That's the question in a. We spent lots of time when our boy was in the first year or so of his life, and that was the reckoning. That was it. It was he could have died, and also a version of him was not what we were expecting. Our lives had changed forever. Something had gone. Something had been let go. It died. And wrapping this back up in the point of the horse without agency, one of the things that I think is most powerful about this opportunity is allowing the multitudes to be in the body. So there are these kind of 4 levels of belonging around mythology broadly. I mean, there's 1,000, but that we play with. Place, a sense of belonging within the place that you're in physically, a sense of belonging within a broader culture or a broader story, a sense of belonging in your own story. Getting down with your own weird story is one of the things that Martin Shaw used to talk about. We all think our origin stories aren't a bit boring, but there's that, and then the 4th layer, which I think is the gateway and one of the most powerful ideas, is feeling belonging in your own body. And that's something to do with, if there's a horse without agency in a story for you, where does that live in your body? And how does it respond to the other actors within the story? On a more basic level, what if there is a rash part of you and a rationalist part of you, and they just refuse to make a call? What does it mean? Where do they live in your body? What is it to accept in a story? Even if you're a mother of 3 and the story's about a mother of 3, you can let that part, of course, play there. But what happens if the mother is in you, and the 3 are in you, and the trees are in you, and the ogre is in you, and the wolf is in you, and the stepping in allows the multitude of self, and then starts coming the multitude of all, and the gentleness of, oh wow. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about a flower being made of non-flower elements. Everything that is a flower is not a flower simultaneously, and that's what starts happening. You asked the question about, I don't think agency in death is such a fine point. I don't know. I'd have to investigate that more deeply. But death generally, when we hold this work, and I say we, meaning Recalling Fire, when we hold this work, grief is a necessary aspect. And if grief is loving what isn't here and gratitude is loving what is here, they're just the deeper capacities for love more broadly. And it's back to that uncertainty again, holding the uncertainty of it rather than looking to solve the uncertainty. The ability, resilience is an ability to be within the thing, not to get to the end of the thing. And I think if agency in death is a question that can be held by imagery and symbolism and horses and wolves and Excalibur and the daftness and gentle pouty face of Merlin, I think there's
Your Merlin feels somewhat different to my Merlin.
Well, I'm curious as well, though. The question for you is the agency of death. Are we talking about initiation?
I see death as an initiation, yes. And one can't. So in the teaching that I have, this could get complex and again slightly longer than an hour. But if we take it down to its bare bones, if we can have a sense of who we are from when we fall asleep to when we wake, and within that, not control the dream time. I'm not interested in lucid dreaming and my ego taking control, but I can hold the thread of a question through the dream time. Then there is a potential that I will be able to have a sense of who I am and hold the thread of a question. And the question is always, what do you want of me? Through the process of dreaming, where our culture, particularly, psychopumping is a thing that part of the job of any shamanic practitioner can be psychopumping, which is helping the lost to be less lost. And a lot of our culture, we get very lost at the point of death and after death because we have no training of what happens and how we might navigate the lands beyond life and the pathways west of the sunset, and helping people just to move with grace through that space is part of what we do. And so that does feel, there is always, it feels to me that there's choices to move on or to stay lost. And that's a really clear choice. And that choosing to stay lost can often be being tied up with the stories that we told ourselves that were not necessarily true and were not necessarily even our stories. A lot of what we're learning is the extent to which our stories of loss and lack are inherited and can come down many, many, many generations. And then the parts of us that get hooked into those can be very loud and very strident in their maintaining of those stories. And what I'm feeling from you in my body, in my heart, in the sense of energy that we're creating, because I don't want to head off into the neurophysiology and the trauma healing and all of that, is that there's a magic in mythology, in the building of different maps that could help those parts to let go of the old stuff that has nothing to do with the life that I live now and could be 10,000 years old, however long since we were last really genuinely in our culture knew ourselves to be an integral part of the web of life. And in the letting go of those stories opens the door to the potential for death to be yet another rite of passage, and that if I have undertaken other rites of passage clear-eyed and with an open heart and a full heart and a strong heart and a clear heart, then a rite of passage isn't a frightening thing. Each one takes me to places I have never been because that's the nature of a rite of passage, but at least the process is one that I can meet with grace and joy and wonder and awe and that sense of, wow, the world is unfolding again. How does that fit with your way of mapping the myths?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that I agree with you that ultimately and fundamentally there is a the bottom line for me is belonging, and asking a question to a group of participants of where do you belong and how deep the wells of a question like that are. The sense of belonging, you could say, sits on a parallel journey to the question of lostness. But I think going back to the original metaphor of the mountain leaders, there's like an admission of lostness first. It's like I think becoming lost is one of the best things we could possibly do in modernity. I think I mean that geographically. I mean that in terms of myth. It's almost the second. What is it? David White says, "You know you're on the right path when it disappears in front of you." The sense of being lost is the way to belong. And back to the mountain leaders, it's not that we are already lost in inverted commas, could be lost in inverted commas, and convincing ourselves we're not, being the biggest challenge. And you describing the shamanic practice of becoming unlost, but the admission of lostness. And I think that's really well connected even to the story of Elderhood and animism. And there's a part of me which believes that no person raised without elders, maybe it's a position I'm exploring, could ever fully become elder themselves. And so the same as someone who's raised rationalist probably couldn't ever become fully animist. But what's the job then of pretending well enough and being able to say, look, we're modeling this, we're doing the best we can, and it's a multi-generational response to this multi-generational wounding. But the position of anyone being full and complete, and I know where I am, and I'm not lost, and I'm this, and I'm this thing, and I'm becoming more and more skeptical of that position. So yeah, I think it's really lovely how that we're doing sort of double speak around the word lost, and it feels like a really interesting place to be in, of what is lost, what is unlost, how does it relate to something ancient, and how does it relate to the ideas of modernity and whatever being clever and successful and right mean these days.
And to what extent is that changing? This feels like it's opening up a lot. Again, everything you say, Sam, opens doors. And so I'm exploring the feeling of lost and certainty and modernity and this idea that unless we have been raised by elders, how do we become elders? In the same way, I think in our culture, nobody can be a shaman unless you have grown in an actual shamanic culture. You can't. You can be a shamanic practitioner, and that's an amazing and wonderful thing. But anyone who tells you they're a shaman, it's not the real thing. However, being lost. So, our culture, the dominant culture, feels to me. I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago who works very high up in a number at the level where he's talking to heads of companies quite a lot, and said that in the last 6 months, the idea has begun to take root that the current system cannot continue. Not that it's bad and shouldn't and isn't sustainable and we ought to be wearing hair shirts and not flying anymore, just that it actually physically can't. Even if they wanted it to, it can't. It is dying. And that gives an extraordinary sense of freedom. That feels to me like watching the walls of the prison walls actually explode open. And then in the lostness of them, when we have been raised as children, our domestication out of the wonderful, wild, vibrant, forager hunter little beings that we are when we're born into the domesticated adults we become, lacking all elderhood. I'm sure you're familiar with Bill Plotkin's work, Animus Valley Institute, and his concept that our culture is locked in early adolescence, and that the severance from elders was very deliberate, many 10,000 years ago, so that there could not be a growing into elderhood, so that we were going to forever be locked in early adolescence, where picking up the sword and waving it around is what you do. And that's appropriate to that level of our evolution. It's just not that staying there is not clever when one could instead evolve to being an elder. But even in a culture where elderhood has been severed for 2,000 generations, how do we go back to that? How do we go back close enough that the next generation is closer, and the next generation closer still, and maybe in 5-10 generations there are actual genuine elders? And so is the lostness, being lost as a gift. I think that feels real for me, and it feels as if it's emergent from what you're saying. And we don't want to replace it with new certainties, because the only thing one could say about the certainties with any certainty is that they're not real. And so how do we? Is it in the sense of belonging? You said that was core for you. Is that where do you belong? If we were talking to these masters of the universe who have until now believed that they knew exactly where they were going and what success looked like and how reality was shaped, and we can come and it's already evident that this is not the case, how do we create the fluidity for life to live through us?
I'd like to invoke one of the first things I said, which is about naming and kenning and making a perfect attempts. before I say anything in response to so big a question. I have some senses. One of my favorite phrases was offered to me by a friend. He said, "Wisdom isn't learning something new. It's being reminded of what you've always known." And I think the I work with leaders. I facilitate groups. I work with young people. It's up and down. There's, it's the writing in the middle of the stick of rock. This doesn't seem to be something which is individualized. There's something about the center of the work that I've been writing about and holding space for over the last couple of years around elderhood. The very fine point of that is, how do you accept a compliment? How do you accept a compliment? Really seems small, but it's taken quite a long time to get there, as a simple mechanism to play with the idea of what we're playing in here. And it came off the back of listening to Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who's got the Spiritual Elder is an audio piece you can listen to, where he talks about the work of eldering and why we're struggling. And he says to the seminar room, he says, if we put all the 90-year-olds in the front row and then the 80-year-olds and then a few rows of 70-year-olds, he says, how are you going to be in your bodies receiving that grace? How are you going to accept that level of grace? What is the challenge of our skilled, beautiful, experienced, life-lived older people to accept grace and feel my whole body still responding to how bereft we are of the exchange between human beings in our culture to be able to offer and receive grace, to be able to say something beautiful to somebody and for them to not either throw it over their shoulder or deflect it back to you. Oh, no, you were it. You brought as much as I did, or, to say anything, but you are welcome. What does that say about the person who can use a phrase like that? How much of their own self are they able to love? How enough can they feel to be able to use a phrase like that? And it's hooked up to the word pride. For me, it's hooked up to what the nodes of success are in our society, what it is to be successful, what it is to don't self-aggrandize, of course. No, don't be demure. That's one side of it, and the other side is claiming everything. I did this. It was all. There's a showboat aspect and a shrinking violet aspect, and somewhere in the middle is something of standing in the power. And then I think there's something of fostering people, older people. I'm interested in, not entirely, but at large, being able to disconnect their popularity from their opinion as a main function of elderhood, to be able to say, this is bonkers, we've gone mad, let's sit in front of Parliament with a sign that I know will get me arrested, the symbols of it happening, calling out elephants in the room, so that we can start moving towards a place of holding uncertainty in a place where people who have had some life experience are able to hold the frame, to hold the line, to be able to bring to bear how many times uncertainty has borne out benefit in their lives. And I love invoking Bronnie Ware here. I'm sure you've come across the top 5 regrets of the dying, an article she wrote that exploded across the Guardian. And the number one regret these people that she'd been listening to on their deathbeds was, I wish I'd lived a life true to myself, not a life others expected of me. So it's this simultaneous disconnect between knowing, being certain and being uncertain, being found and being lost, and this endless need to be performative and please people and hit sweet spots so that people feel safe enough. This wisdom isn't learning something new, it's being reminded of what you've always known. And there's something of the grown-ups doing some remembering of what they've always really known. and rejecting some of the really new ideas and some of the less new ideas about what's successful.
And being heard.
And this is the other side of it. And part of the reason I'm really fascinated by your work is, is it a requirement of modernity for individuals to experience crisis and trauma in order that they have a becoming, have a sense of initiation? Because we don't have the culture and the broader agreements around that being normal yet. We haven't for many years. Is it a requirement for us to have, in our trauma culture, to have these moments of crisis and trauma in order to want to move towards someone to bless, to offer grace to? And if that's a yes, then is the work less about going out and finding youngers to be an elder to? And is it more about, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink? Is it more about making the most nourishing source of water we possibly can for when there is a readiness to drink? And we just rely on the unfolding crisis and trauma to enable that?
That is a really interesting question. What's your feeling? I have ideas, but where does it take you?
I work with a group called A Band of Brothers, so I'm a mentor within this charity, which works with young men who are at risk of or already involved in the criminal justice system. And the broad line across that is no good male role models in their lives has led them to that, or largely in the care system. And we work with the whole process of rite of passage. There's an initiation moment. There's elders. We work with mythology. It's several days away, no phones. You don't know that you're going to be okay all the way through. Sign the disclaimer, all that sort of business. There's many things as we can do to make it real. And in that instance, the young men we work with, they are hitting crisis. They're hitting moments of crisis. They're being dropped by our systems. They're tantamount to someone on their deathbed asking the nurse to help them how to die, and being told, "Sorry, no, we don't have that." So the only working manifest model I have of it does have that as a prerequisite. Yes, there's a breaking point, and my own work, what I'm interested in, and the dichotomy I have is that myth is, you've either got a taste for it or it's a bit silly. It's either kind of Tolkien or the Avengers or Disney, or it's either that you're in and you'll be in with a storyteller and you there's a sense of enjoying mythology, or it's a kind of held at arm's length sort of, when somebody says once upon a time, that's the time for the adults to leave the room and let the children be dazzled by the person in the silly hat with the shaky stick. And there's something of this work and this conversation whereby I think someone who wouldn't normally move towards mythology, being given some of the images within it, might find their way without it needing to be a manifest crisis trauma moment. And increasingly, I told you I studied at Dartington College of Arts. That was about uncertainty. My son was born, masses of uncertainty. Mythology is uncertainty. The facilitation work that I do is uncertainty. And the fullness of this work will be, when I'm doing it right, I'll get phone calls. Yeah, I'm not saying this happens yet. I'm saying in the future, from people who have tried things, maybe coaching, maybe therapy, maybe offsites with their leadership teams. Maybe they've been to a conference and something has moved for them, and then they've got home and they've forgotten what the thing was that was moving. And they'll call somebody like me or you and say, you know what, I'm willing to have an emergency contact number, a good pair of boots and a compass, and not know what else is going to happen for 4 days. So I do think there's if there's a curiosity about placing oneself into a position of uncertainty, maybe that's another way as well, I think. So I'm interested in your take, but my semi-shaped answer is, I think uncertainty, I go around the world trying to foster uncertainty everywhere I can. And I think that gentle invitation for some might be enough, but I don't know.
And I think as this year unfolds, anyone's capacity to hold on to certainty, or everyone's capacity to hold on to certainty, is going to be shaken loose. Last year, it was possible. After this year, I don't think it will be. And I would be very interested. One of the things that arose when you were talking about moments of crisis is, I don't know how I would go about finding someone in our culture who is not experiencing a string of moments of crisis. You couldn't do the control of that. Everyone. What they define as crisis would necessarily be different. But I'm remembering Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal. I haven't met anybody who has not considered themselves to be perpetually hopping from one crisis to the next. And some of them are very global north crises, but that doesn't stop them being deeply felt by the person. I was listening to a coaching podcast the other day, and somebody was saying, they were talking about coaching business, but that what we need to remember is that in every chief executive who's making very bad decisions, there is a 5-year-old melting down. And we forget, and we think, because this guy has the power suit and the big car and the Rolex and the capacity to sack everybody, that they've somehow done all the work. And of course they haven't. And probably less than the janitors, or at least potentially less than the janitors. And so opening the doors to that feels to me that what you're doing with mythology, I'm really interested that you say people walk away from mythology. And I think one of the things that perhaps we can normalize is the fact that mythology is the sea that we swim in. The death cult of predatory capitalism is its own mythology. GDP must keep rising is a mythology. Strong men can make good decisions is a manifestly broken mythology. Mythology is, myths are the maps that we live by, and they are of necessity not the territory. And as I am just in awe of your mountain leaders pointing out that when you're lost, the last thing you do is look at the map. What you do is find where you are and then draw your own maps. And even drawing maps is such an act of magic. I imagine being the first human being who thought that I take a stick and I draw perhaps on the sand on the cave floor that the river's here and there's a little set of stones there and you can walk across it, and it's much easier than trying to swim across here. Mapping is a magical thing, and yet knowing that the map is not the territory is crucial. And our culture, it seems to me, a lot of the dysfunction of our current culture is not recognizing the myths as myths, and then also thinking that they are the territory, and maintaining this bizarre mindset. It's breaking down so fast. I think watching, I don't watch the news, but I kind of get it filtered through on social media of a particular style, particularly in politics, of rhetorical questioning that takes as given a very, very narrow boundary set of realities. And then along comes Zach Polanski and goes, I don't actually think that premise is accurate. And you can see the panic in their eyes. They genuinely don't know where to go, because for them that is the world, and that's they got the job because that is their world. If they'd questioned it, they would not be there. But now you've got somebody who has the legitimacy of having had a huge amount of votes cast, and in our culture, part of the mythology is that this gives you a right to speak, and they're saying no, that bit of the map is just not worth having anymore, and it opens doors in ways that need to be opened and that have not heretofore been opened, because nobody's who knew that has had the soapbox from which to speak it. So I'm guessing that in your world you can shape myths in ways that the adults don't feel they need to leave the room. Yes.
Yes, and well caught. Being more specific, oral storytelling is the mechanism.
It's a thing.
By which people have to make a dare to move toward.
Like when you were at Dartington and Martin Shaw was already there, and you were busy ignoring the posters telling you about this guy who was telling stories.
The football was on. Come on.
Yeah.
exactly. And
Sam, you
that's
so
the
don't look like a football person.
no, I was,
Okay,
and
there's my projection.
I'm not. But I think really well said, really well said. Thank you, and loving seeing somebody like Zap Polanski not have to speak in tongues.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. But I think the key point for me, and what I mean by kenning it, at least, what one of the things I mean by mythocartography is is how we're engaging with our maps. That's the bit. So agree, making maps is magic and beautiful. And I'm really fascinated by this. You're about to tell me that you already know somebody doing this. I'm fascinated by the idea of maps which are scaled based on how long it takes for a certain being to move through them. So, for example, what would it be to draw a map where the bog, and it's from a human perspective, the bog is huge, but the road is tiny, even if the one is a foot across and the other one's 4 miles? How long? How much time or something?
Hmm. I don't actually know anyone who's
Okay,
already doing this,
okay,
but I think it's a
okay,
very interesting door you're opening, and we should be doing it together.
okay. Well, great. Let's. And what does bird's eye mean? And then we're into what's the purpose of the map. The point I make in the essay is OS maps, gold standard, beautiful, love them. They've given me all sorts of access to the world. Were originally commissioned by the Ministry of Defence equivalent in the time. What was the point of that map? What's the point of the map of no belonging that flops out of the Industrial Revolution and so on? And so if the practice of how we engage our maps, how we so I've got two examples that sit right side by side. One is back to the mountain leader guys, just as you said. What they say is, if you're really lost, the first thing to do is put your map down and be in the world. What can you see? What can you smell? What can you hear? What can you touch? What can you taste? What's your proprioception doing? What's your belly doing? What's your heart doing? What can you choose to mean life as I experience it, which is a non-negotiable that I
Hmm.
expect to see represented on this map. And if it's not on this map, I reject the map. Look up, look at the map. It's not on there. It might be as simple as saying, oh, there was a bridge over there. I don't see a bridge on my map, so I'm not going to believe the map. And how does that scale up to global? What is it to say, I believe a good life to be connected to the way I treat the people I physically live nearby?
Hmm.
My neighbors are important to me. I know that. That's a remembering. That's a wisdom thing. Huh. The map I'm in doesn't have anything to say about that supports that. Maybe I can reject this idea. So there's the how we might take the metaphor of the map is not the territory and use it as a continuous tool of re-engagement with the map and the map choices we're making. That's the one. And the other is this phrase. When I work with associates and friends and myth makers, and goes all the way up and down from the nature people to the consultants. It's beautiful. I have an agreement that we make, which is that we won't use the phrase use mythology. We're not going
Say that
to
again. I didn't hear it properly.
use mythology.
Use, as in I use this
Yes.
thing.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, right.
And so that it's a small thing, but it sets. I set out my stall for where I am. First of all, I don't think it's possible to use mythology. I think they're bigger than us, they're broader than us, they're more uncontained than us, they're also within us, we're entrenched in it. It's all using it isn't even possible. But also it's the decentralization of the human aspect of, the to know something, to get a handle on, to apprehend, to get these ideas of domination. There's nothing in the natural world that has a handle on it. The second that you say you're going to get a handle on something, you've de-animized it. It's no longer allowed to be. It's a human thing that has a human. They have appendages and wings and gills and petals but no handles. And so there's something about the language and beautifully. You might already have gone down this track, but etymologically speaking, understand, the roots of the word understand. I had this moment going along one day where I realized the word that had defined how I engage with the world, understand, was a nonsense word. Understand is the word we use to mean that we kind of have a sense of things, but the Middle English is actually more closely related to stand within, not so which to me is much more evocative of a whirlwind or a hedgerow maze or an experiential something which is moving all
Yeah.
around me, and
Or a
that for
forest
me,
or a river or
right, and so I'm much more happy with the word understand, to use it, to use, um, and then back stepping out of where I started that, to use mythologies and to use maps, if by definition you're calling them resources which are to be used and therefore will have been used, what does that do to be a user of something at all? What's that? What kind of an engagement with anything in life is, and what then are we calling our map? What is it to decide there is such a thing as a resource, and how does that underpin the whole conversation around metacrisis and polycrisis?
yeah. And to what extent then do we begin to pick apart our language? Nate Higgins had Indy Johar on The Great Simplification a while ago, and he always asked the question at the end of, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you change? And Indy said, I would change it so that everybody used verb-based languages instead of noun-based languages. Which is but you can't change that overnight. We could all learn Lakota, but we wouldn't have the Lakota mindset. You can't just change the language. The language is in our bones, and I have great awe for people who have 7 languages and can fluidly dream in all of them differently. But the language of the metacrisis at this moment is English, I feel. I'm sure it can be translated into French and German and all of the other Western European languages, but there is something about English that has been brought into service of a particular way of being, and in the richness of whoever it was who said that English is the language that 7 languages walk down a dark alley and English walks out the other end and the rest are left tatters at the back. It's so rich in terms of the sourcing, and as you said, Middle English evolved. It's an evolutionary language that drew on many, 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 many roots. And can we? I love working with the threads of it and the feel of it, and how can we make it a full-hearted language without necessarily saying everything we have to be verbing everything, which feels like that's not good when people take a noun and turn it into a verb. I don't like it. So this feels like this is probably podcast number 2, because I'm aware that we're already way over time. So perhaps we leave that one of, how do we take the wonder that is the language that we grew up with? And in the same way, I'm on a quest of, how do we stop being ashamed of being human? Because that's not useful, and that's what we've been offered so much, particularly by very well-meaning people who understand the meta crisis. It's shaming people for being who we are is not going to help. How do we evolve to be in a world where being human is a source of great, genuine pride? In that pride that arises from, I feel respect from the energies that I respect, the human and the more than human. I am being something worthy of respect, and that gives me a sense of pride. How do we generate the groundswell? It feels to me that stories are the warp and the weft of the tapestry of who we are. And knowing them as stories opens them up and lets there be new stories. And however you are reaching people, Sam, it feels to me as if you are opening the stories to being and belonging and heart opening in ways that will allow new stories to emerge that we have no idea what they are. If we could tell what they were, we'd already be there, and we're not. How is that landing? We're going to have to close soon, but I would like to talk to you forever, actually, but we'll definitely come back for another go. A little bit about the story of the moment. How does that land with you?
Yeah, I thank you, and bless you for reining us in to stop before the 6-hour mark. I think I heard you just say the language of the meta crisis is English, and I just think in and of itself an extraordinary poem to speak to the encounter of this experience. I think just to touch on it, and maybe these are just way markers for another time, but Tolkien said at some point that tree isn't a good enough word for tree. And I am interested in telling my son that the tree is treeing, despite your
Right. Okay. No, that's
your
good.
dis
That's all right.
and I think there's something to do with shame hooked up in there that whatever mistakes we're making or codifying or that accepting that that's part of the deal and part of the process rather than something to be thrown out and discarded. And it is about fostering the multi-generational. It is little steps now to see how they might unfold later on. I want to invoke Tristan and Isolde quickly. So Tristan and Isolde is the Cornish story which obsessed medieval Europe and inspired Shakespeare to write Romeo and Juliet, and is in the wheelhouse, or is in the same sort of stable as Cilych and Olwen from Welsh myth, and the pursuit of Dermot and Grania from the Irish. And there is something extraordinary about the watersheds of Europe. Tristan and Isolde stays within one flowscape, one space, one territory beyond culture, beyond geography, beyond county
So
lines.
kind of like a bioregion? Are we mythological bioregions?
Yeah,
That would be exciting.
Yeah, exactly. There's something about that. A burgeoning relationship with a local guy down here called Morden, who's interested in what he calls Mama Kerno and the Cornish language and the Proto-Celtic, and the Welsh word hiraeth.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
There's a Cornish version which is hireth, the same word. He's got some beautiful reconfiguring of how we've missed maybe part of the essence of what we think we mean when we say hiraeth is an untranslatable Welsh, which means something to do with nostalgia for a home that you never had or something like that. And he goes, wait a minute, you said it's untranslatable and then translated it and moved on. So he comes back to some of that, and he's the one who's sharing some of these images of potential bioregion, which the story of Tristan and Isolde is contained within. Now the point I'm making is Tristan and Isolde is something that we know Wagner has worked with. It's a vague romance that we have being so liberal with the word we. There is something in the culture around what Tristan and Isolde is or could be, in the same way that there is for King Arthur. And in my investigation of it, it's taken me full circle down into this place, down into where I am, down into the sense that rivers used to be so beautiful that they were hard to talk about, and that the experience of goddess was something about putting your forehead down on the ground and submitting, rather than full face up to the sky and proclaiming, something like that. And it's all living in one of the most beautiful and brutal, tragic romances I've ever come across. And so there is hey, if you like storytelling, this is interesting. There's if you come from anywhere near this place, or the sense of, I don't know what place is, it's a layer down. If there's something of, there are definitely parts in me which I don't know how or why they speak to each other in the way that they do. And I feel something first thing in the morning, and I feel aggravated some part of some days. And there's a pattern in me, which is, I don't know who I am at 11 a.m. because I've had so many meetings happening. There's something about orienting deeply to the self within a story like this. And it's just on the edge of something we generally, culturally, engagement with movies and books, and it's on the edge of something we know about. It's on the edge of something we have access to, and that's what I'm interested in representing. That's what I'm standing for, and that's why speaking with somebody like you and the world that you're in goes beyond this sense of, hey, how can story help us with some of the problems we already know about, and move into what has mythology got to do with helping us see the things we don't even know we're facing. I have a strange feeling in my body about the way things and the way that culture is. I don't know what that is. That's the calling towards mythology. That's the calling towards oral storytelling. That's the calling towards something way older than we even need to bother trying to understand. But just letting it in, the next step is, if you feel overwhelmed, go outside, lift your shirt up and put your stomach down on the soil. That's the next step.
Thank you.
Hmm.
I think that's a brilliant place to stop, actually, Sam. We could talk all day. We could have the 6-hour podcast, and maybe sometime we'll come back and do the other 4 hours and the remaining 10 hours after that. But for now, I think go outside, lie on the ground, connect your skin to the soil. Feels a good place to stop. Thank you for all that you are and do. This feels really, really as if whole new maps are opening up, and whatever we do with the metaphor of the map, it feels really generative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the generosity of spirit as well, and the openness all the way through. Let's see how it unfolds.
Thank you.